Hello. We're beginning our study of the book of Ruth. A little small book, but it has tremendous insight in several different areas. I think it was originally written to show something about the ancestry of David, because the very conclusion of the book really shows the purpose of the book. But it also shows us one of those beautiful little sidelines about how Moabitess is part of the line of the Messiah. God kind of brings in Rahab to show that he loves even a Canaanite prostitute. And here he brings in a Moabitess, from which Deuteronomy 23:7 says they can't ever enter the congregation of Israel, and yet here's one with great faith in the line of the Messiah. The book of Ruth appears in our English Bible after the book of Judges. This was first done by the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Old Testament, followed by the Latin Vulgate, and then we followed it in English. It's probably there because chapter 1, verse 1 seems to say in the period when the judges judged, and so we put the little book right after Judges. The Hebrew Canon is broken into three divisions: the Torah, which is Genesis through Deuteronomy; the former and the latter prophets, which is basically the historical books of Joshua through 2 Kings, and then what we think of the prophets, which would be Isaiah through Malachi. But the third division is the writings, and it includes Ruth and Daniel and the wisdom literature and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, there are five little books we call the Megilloth, and each one of them is read at a different feast day. Ruth is one of those, and read during the Feast of Pentecost. I think this is going to be an exciting little book, and so let's cover chapter 1 today. I want to mention to you that out of 85 verses, 50 verses are direct dialogue, which shows that the storyteller will develop his plot through people speaking with each other. Now, it came about in the days when the judges governed. There's a cognate word here, the word judges, and then the verb judged. I think the word judge is better understood as deliverer. So when the deliverers delivered would be a good way to put it. There was a famine in the land. Now, this is one of the points that the Jewish rabbis say, that this famine was a divine judgment on the land because of the cycles of apostasy that we studied in the book of Judges. We learned from Deuteronomy 27 and 28, the cursing and blessing chapters, that if the Hebrews kept the covenant of Yahweh, he would bless them in every area, including rain and abundance, agricultural fruitfulness. But if they broke the covenant, he would send the same plagues on them that he sent on Egypt. This, of course, was fulfilled in the Promised Land in Joshua chapter 8 on Mount Ebal and Mount Gezerim with Shechem down the valley. This famine in the Bible is kind of like a leprosy or barrenness. God is seen behind this. This little book has the theme running right through it, that God is in control of all things. He's even going to use the problems of this family to bring about a blessing. Now, and a certain man of Bethlehem, now Bethlehem means house of bread. Here it says, in Judah, there was another Bethlehem in the tribal allocation of Zebulun. This originally was called Ephraim. If you might see Micah chapter 5, verse 2, it calls Bethlehem Ephrathah, which is the older name combined with the new. We see this older name in Genesis chapter 35, verse 19, chapter 48, verse 7. To sojourn. Now, the word sojourn means to be a resident alien. We know they're at least going to stay there 10 years, and probably longer than that. Now, there seems to be some possible condemnation here. If God was sending judgment on the Promised Land, and this man seems to be a very leading citizen, is he trying to escape God's judgment by simply moving instead of trusting God for provision? Well, that's what Baba Bathra 91a says, followed by other Jewish literature in the Talmud. And so they see this as a judgment on this man for leaving. The three deaths are connected with this, and we'll develop this undercurrent as we go a little further. In the land of Moab. Now, the word means fields of Moab. Some have said this refers to a particular part of Moab, but I'm not sure we're trying to designate a certain agricultural area. It seems to mean he went to live in Moab. If we read too much in here like a rural area and it was on one of these higher plains, we may be reading more than the author intended. But with his wife and two sons. Now, Moab, in Deuteronomy 23:3, is condemned as far as the men coming into the covenant community. Marrying Moabite women is really never condemned. Matter of fact, in 1 Samuel 22:3 and 4, we know there was a friendly relationship between Moab and King David. And that kind of sets the stage for the book of Ruth. It's obvious the book of Ruth was written sometime after the close of David's reign. And the name of the man was Elimelech. Now, El meaning God and Melech meaning king. Something like my God is king or God is king, something like that. And the name of his wife was Naomi. We think it means pleasantness, sweetness. And the names of the two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Now, Mahlon means sickness, and Chilion means wasting. Some commentators have said that the symbolic meaning of the names of the people of this book obviously show it's not literal, it's a dramatic presentation. But maybe these children were named this because they were sick at birth. We're just not sure. Now, notice it says they were Ephraimites of Bethlehem in Judea. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with two sons. And they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. Now, there's not a condemnation of this, though the rabbis say there's a silent condemnation. And the name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. We think Orpah may mean, it comes from the Hebrew word for neck. And some say stiff-necked. But it may mean she had a beautiful neck. One time in Song of Songs, the author says, you have a neck like the Tower of David. Well, maybe it's a compliment. And the other one, Ruth, we're not exactly sure of her name at all, so I think we ought to hold off on the meaning of that one. And they lived there about 10 years after they married these two sons. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, and the woman was bereaved of her two children and her husband. Again, it's almost an implied kind of way of God judging her in this way. All the men she depended on had died, and there was no children. Apparently the women were barren, or the sons had a problem. Now later on, Ruth is going to have a child. It either means that God opened her womb, as he did with so many other women in the Old Testament, to show his provision, or it simply means that Boaz was fertile, where this other son of Naomi was not. Then she arose with her daughter-in-law that they might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. Now the implication here is that because there was not food meant the Lord had not visited his people, which kind of confirms the Jewish interpretation that this family was running from the judgment of God. But the judgment of God caught up with them. And so here we have she heard. Does that mean the people of Moab talked about what was happening in Israel? Yes, I'm sure that happens in countries that surround. And what we have here then is that very common thing about that Israel was to be a witness to the surrounding nations. God wanted to bless them as he did here, but quite often they were so unrepentant and uncovenantal that he only had to judge them. But Israel was meant to be a blessing as far as revealing God to the nations. So she departed from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Now probably they had already started down the road, and they began to talk about this. And Ruth begins to explain to them why it's not a good idea for them to return to her. I think they had all left. Maybe they weren't planning on going very far, or maybe they had already packed up everything and were on the way. It's interesting to me to note that all of these names in this first chapter have been found at the archaeological site of Ugarit. We get the Ugaritic tablets from this. So all of these were very common names of its day, which shows the historicity of the book of Ruth. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go and return each of you to her mother's house." There's been some wonder about that. Why not mention the father's house? Well, probably here, in a day of polygamy, there could have been several wives, and of course this daughter would turn to the tent of her mother. There were separate tents in that day, one for the man, one for the women, or even living quarters and houses, and so a kind of a way of saying the girl would return to the women part of the house, and particularly be with her mother. I think it's very common. And may the Lord deal kindly with you. It's interesting to me that Naomi brings up the covenant name for God, Yahweh, here. It's interesting to wonder if these two girls had become proselytes of Yahweh, although you can't tell it from the text, and there's no condemnation when Orpah goes back. There's a subtle undercurrent that Naomi had been sharing with Ruth about the Lord, and apparently Ruth is a convert, as we will see in just a minute. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Apparently these girls were very good wives, kind to Naomi's sons, and very respectful of Ruth, even after the death of the sons. May the Lord, again, Yahweh, the covenant name for God, grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. This is kind of Naomi's way of saying, girls, I hope you remarry. You're young, If you return with me, the prospects of you marrying an Israelite are not real good. You need to stay here, and I hope you find a good man. That's what verse 13 seems to be implying also. And they said to her, No, but we will surely return with you to your people. And Naomi said, Return, my daughters. Notice it's not daughter-in-laws anymore. It's an affectionate relationship between these women. My daughters, she calls them. Why should you go with me? Yet have I yet in my womb that I may that they may be your husbands? Now, what does this mean, sons in my womb? This is a reference to Levirate marriage. There's a reference here in verse 11, an obvious reference in verse 13. It goes back to Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10, where we talk about Levirate marriage. Now, not Levite marriage, but Levirate, from the Latin word for brother. The tribal allotments of the Promised Land were so important that if a brother died, his another kin was to raise up an heir for him. What Naomi is saying is, even if I could have children, and I was to get pregnant tonight, you would have to wait till they grew up, and then you'd be too old. And so she's beginning to explain in very logical ways why it's not good for these ladies to wait. Return, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. And if I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight, and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they grow? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? So she's presenting a very logical argument. No, my daughters, for it is harder for me. Now the word here is bitter. We think there's going to be a play on the word bitter. Down in verse 20, the word Mara means bitter. And that's what she thinks she's playing on even yet. It is harder for me than for you. They lost a husband, but she lost a husband and two sons. They had nobody. She had nobody. They had their families. The hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. Now, this is an anthropomorphic metaphor. The hand of the Lord. We know the Lord does not have a physical body. So to speak of his hand usually is a way of speaking of his right hand, to speak of his power. Naomi believed that God was involved in the judgment on her husband and two sons. The Jews say, because down here a little bit later where it says it was a great stir in verse 19, that Elimelech was a very wealthy and well-to-do man of Bethlehem. And when God's judgment came, he fled from it. And Naomi realizes this. That may be true. We just can't prove it from the text. Also, the word go forth against me is a military term of men going out to battle. Naomi sees the hand of God in everything in her life. I want to tell you, that's a pretty good way to look at life. There was a book that's been such a blessing to me in this area of problems and crisis and wondering if God loves us by what happens to us. May I say to you the little book by Hannah Whitall Smith, Quaker lady back from the 1800s, The Christian Secret of a Happy Life, has been such a blessing to me. And I also want to remind you that Hebrews Chapter 12, verses 5 and following, talks about the Lord disciplining his children. We need to think through what Naomi was saying. Nothing just happens to God's children. Now, I'm not sure that God's judging them for leaving. It may have been it just happened that these boys died in the normal course of a fallen world. But God's going to use it. I'm not saying he sent it, but I'm saying he's going to use it. Romans 8:28 and 29 is a beautiful promise. Notice where then it goes in verse 14. And they lifted up their voices and wept again. The Oriental weeping is very loud and emotional. I think they have less ulcers because of that. And so here they raised their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her, grabbed onto her, held to her. Then she said, Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Now that bothers me. If she was a proselyte, why would she go back to her gods? Maybe because if she returned home, she would have to do that. I'm not sure. The god of Ammon is the god Chemosh. We see him mentioned in Numbers 21:29 and 1 Kings 11:7. Return after your sister-in-law. Apparently Orpah had already gone. Orpah is not condemned for going back because really she is just obeying Ruth. I get those two mixed up, forgive me. She's obeying Naomi. But Ruth has a very sincere commitment to this relationship. Notice as it follows. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord do to me and worse, if anything except death parts you and me. Now that at first may not seem rather striking, but I want to explain the implications of that. Number one, Naomi apparently had lost all her land when she left. they're going back to a life of poverty. The deal about where you lodge, I'll lodge, Ruth wasn't expecting a fancy house. She wasn't expecting to marry someone rich. She was expecting a life of poverty with her mother-in-law. She was also expecting a life of non-marriage. For a Moabite to go back to Judah probably meant that she would not have any opportunities to marry. She was willing to live without a husband, even though she was young, because of her love for this mother-in-law. Many times during weddings, young people want me to read this in their service. I think it's a very beautiful commitment, but it kind of always bothers me. It's a commitment between two women here and not a man and a woman, though it shows a deep love relationship. Notice, if you would, please, where it says here, let's see, your people shall be my people and your God my God. I really think this is a oath not only of loyalty to the people of God, but a faith commitment to Yahweh. If we talk about you must personally receive Christ in a relationship, it looks to me like Ruth is doing this. Now, it may be because of her love for Naomi, but obviously Naomi and her faith and trust in the midst of all this crisis had showed Ruth that the God Naomi served, even though Naomi was feeling like God was against her, she still loved him and worshiped him and served him. I think Ruth was impressed and wanted to be a part of that kind of God. Now, this where you die, I will die. This is another implication here. You don't see it immediately from the text, but I think it's very important. As you know, young people children were one way of like a health insurance plan, like a retirement fund. For when a person got old, the young persons were to help them. What Ruth is saying is, Naomi, I know you don't have anybody to take care of you. I'm going to come take care of you, and I'm going to take care of you all the days of your life. I'm going to make sure you're buried. I'm going to make sure you're buried right, and I'm going to stay with you, and I'm going to stay there after that. Watch out for your grave. Whatever needs to be done, I'm going to take care of it, and there I'm going to be buried with you. What a commitment this young lady has. Now, this little oath here in verse 17, may the Lord do to me and worse. Notice it's the covenant name for God. Here Ruth is using the covenant name for God, Yahweh. In your Bible, when it's all capital letters, it shows it's the covenant name for God from Exodus 3:14 that comes from the Hebrew verb to be. I am. Sometimes it's translated, I am that I am, I will be. I think a good translation would be, I am the ever-living, only living God. She swears by God's name that this covenant is going to be apparently true till death, something like cross my heart and hope to die that we sometimes do in our culture. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Verse 19. But they both went until they came to Bethlehem, apparently Naomi and Elimelech's hometown. And they came about when they came to Bethlehem that all the city was stirred because of them. And there's been several theories here. The Jews say it's because Elimelech was a very wealthy, important man who had run away years before. That may be true. There is a possibility there. Because Ruth says, Naomi says, I went out full and I've come back empty. That may be an implication of wealth and prestige and preeminence and prominence, or it may simply mean I went out with a husband and two sons, a full family. The other thing is, maybe they were wondering about why she returned after all this time. Maybe they were concerned about here came two single women, kind of unusual, them traveling together, and one of them was a Moabitist. Maybe that's the implication already. We're just not sure. I'm sure Naomi must have dressed like a Moabitist. She had an accent like a Moabitist, and they knew very quickly who she was. Because the text says, because of them, and the women said, is this Naomi? Apparently she'd been gone over 10 years. She looked different. I'm sure that her grief at the death of her husband and the death of her two sons had caused her. Maybe she had gray hair now and crow's feet. I don't know. They said, is this Naomi? They kind of recognized her, but they weren't sure. And she said to them, do not call me Naomi, which means pleasant or sweet. Call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Notice again that Naomi attributes her condition directly to God. In the Old Testament, you must remember that God is the only source. He's the source of everything. The evil spirit of the Lord comes upon Saul in the Samuel. Isaiah, I believe 45:7, chapter 54 talks about that from God comes calamity as well as blessing. He is the only source, and I think Ruth is kind of parroting that theology. Now the word Almighty is very interesting. It's the word El Shaddai. That's the patriarchal name for God. This is the name that Abraham called God, and Isaac and Jacob. For we learn from Exodus chapter 6 that Yahweh was not really called Yahweh until Moses' day, when God explained that name to Moses. Before, they called him El Shaddai. Now, that's kind of difficult because this name appears in our Bible in Exodus chapter 2. I think they may have used the name, but didn't really know what it meant until Yahweh revealed himself in the burning bush. There has been some interesting etymology done. There's many theories. You can get different concordances and Hebrew word studies. Some say the word El means strong. But there's another possibility. Further archaeological study has shown that Shaddai may refer to a woman's breast and should possibly be translated God the All-Sufficient One. If that's true, it's another example of God used or described as a woman metaphor. There are several of these, surprisingly so. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, the Spirit of God brooded over the waters. Oh, brooded's a mother bird word, a hen for her chicks. This is what Jesus used of himself when he said, Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets, how I would have gathered you together as a hen does her chicks, but you would not. Jesus described his own feelings as a mother chicken. In Isaiah chapter 19, Exodus 19 and Isaiah 40, it says how I bore you on eagle's wings. We learn from watching eagles that only the lady eagle carries the young. The male eagles are out being symbols of nations or something. So here's another feminine metaphor to describe God. And I think in Hosea chapter 11, God is described as a nursing parent. The word ox and the word infant are only one different letter in Hebrew, and the context seems to describe parenting. And also El Shaddai, I think, means a woman's breast. You might want to see Griddlestone, a very interesting book. Synonyms of the Old Testament by Griddlestone is one of several sources. And also the Tyndale Old Testament Commentary is an excellent book, excellent commentary on Ruth, along with the Anchor Bible. And it deals with the same possible etymology. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Catch the play on the word Mara again. I went out full, but Yahweh has brought me back empty. Again, God's in control of her life. She's hurt now, but she still is going to, as you're going to see, is going to trust. She's come home. She's come home, I think, because of her faith. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? She's upset. You know, I used to think it's sad for us to say, God, why did you do this? And boy, God's put the bite on me. But you know, after reading Jeremiah, where Jeremiah says what seemed to be such mostly almost blasphemous things to God, I think God can handle our true emotions rather than this piety, this false piety that's always saying, oh, wonderful God, when inside we're saying, God, why? Why did this happen to me? God, where were you? God, why? I don't think Naomi knows why. I think she does believe that God's in control of all things. I can't explain that either, but I do believe it. So Naomi returned with Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. This will be sometime about the end of April, 1st of May. The other things are getting ready to be harvested, and we're going to see from the rest of the account, this is a very important thing because Ruth is going to have to go out and glean in the field, and this is where she's going to meet Boaz. This is a wonderful literary book, only 4 chapters, but boy, this man, whoever wrote this, probably after the time of David, had a way of telling this account with no extraneous words. Everything seems to fit into place. After reading all these first few chapters, I really do believe, along with the Talmud, that probably there's an implication of the judgment of God fell on this family. But interestingly enough, though the judgment of God may have fallen on them, God is going to use even this judgment for a tremendous blessing. Not only to explain some of the ancestry of David, but I think to show the Jews that God loves the whole world. You see, I think that the fact that Melchizedek in Genesis 14 is not a Hebrew, the fact there was another prophet besides Moses, Balaam, false prophet though he may be in the end, he still knew God and prophesied truly. Rahab, the harlot, becoming a part of the people of God, and tradition says she married Joshua and Jeremiah as one of the descendants. Wow, what a frisky story that was. And here we have Ruth, the Moabitess, that Deuteronomy 23:20 says that a Moabitess can't enter the congregation of Israel to the 10th generation, which is the word to mean ever, completely. God saying, I love all the world, and I want to bless the world through you. See, I think that's the whole thrust of Genesis chapter 12. The whole world's going to be blessed. And here is a Moabitess who's turned to the Lord. As the resident aliens who aren't Hebrews are brought into the covenant community in Deuteronomy, here the great faith of this Moabitess is going to be seen, and how she loves her mother-in-law, how she commits to her mother-in-law's God, and how she follows her mother-in-law in the rest of this account. Well, I hope you'll read the rest of Ruth. It's a kind of book you can read in one sitting, and I think Bible study is so much better if you read the book at one time, because remember, the Bible is not isolated little chapters. Every book is a whole book. Every book is one message. They're really meant to be read all at one sitting. And Ruth is an easy one, where Jeremiah would be a very hard one. So read it all at once and get the overall flow, the overall picture in your mind, and I think you'll be able to see how this plot develops so beautifully. Please think about the Tyndale Old Testament commentary series. It's a wonderful commentary. Have never found a bad Old Testament book in the Tyndale or a New Testament Tyndale. You'll like those. They're inexpensive. They're very good. The Anchor Bible on this is very detailed, and I think it will help you. And also, this Synonyms of the Old Testament by Griddlestone will really help you understand the New Testament better. And it's indexed, so it'll open up the Old and its words to you. I've really enjoyed being with you. And I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.